So, before we go into the main meat of our discussion today, this is a little prelude, and it's fascinating. It's a Chinese report about the Zamzam well, and it's a little snapshot in time. The first story about Mecca recorded in Chinese literature is in a book called Shi Lin Guan Ji, Extended Reports from the Real World. It is an anecdote about Mecca told by a dashi merchant in a seaport in Fujian province, probably the seaport of Zaytun, nowadays city of Guangzhou. From it, we can see the actual use of Zamzam water. And so it's from 1225 AD, so it's a few centuries after Islam has begun. So by that stage, the various stories have begun to take shape and settle down. And it's by Shen Yuan Yang, if I pronounced the name correctly. It's titled Nation of Mojia, Mecca. Okay. This was anciently a desert with no people or settlements. The ancestor of Dashi, called Pu Lo Hong, Ibrahim, was endowed from childhood with a remarkable personality. When he grew up, he married a wife, which is here referring to Hagar, who gave birth in the desert to a son. There was no water for washing the baby, so she put the baby on the ground and went to look for water without finding any. When she returned, she saw her son kicking the ground with his heel, and a spring came forth with the purest of water. The son was given the name Shi Ma Yan, Ishmael. A large well was built there which never ran dry, even in a drought. So this is the tale that the Muslims believed in 1225. And here's the little interesting detail as well, which might go some way to illustrate the superstitions of the people at the time in relation to the Zamzam well. If you go to sea and meet stormy waves, you can use this water to sprinkle over the sea to calm it. Well, there we go, 1225 AD. And here is the text. So if you can read Chinese, you can read it there for yourself. Again, another similar story about the Zamzam water was recorded 200 years later in the Ming dynasty. This time it was told by a Muslim actually traveling to Mecca. So this is 1433 AD, Ying Yai Sheng Lan, the overall survey of the ocean's shores. And it's by Ma Hua. Okay, 1433 AD. Okay. It starts with the following phrase, which is instantly intriguing. Behind the grave of Muhammad is a well, a spring of pure and sweet water named Abi Sansan. Men who go to foreign parts take this water and store it at the sides of their ships. If they meet a typhoon at sea, they take this water and scatter it, and the wind and waves are lulled. Scholars suggest that Abi Sansan could etymologically be from the Persian language meaning water of Zamzam. This is according to my Chinese scholar friend. I have no opinion on this, and if there's any Persian speakers, perhaps you can either confirm or deny this. And to go back to that opening phrase, behind the grave of Muhammad is a well. Now, I thought the Sen always said Muhammad was buried in Medina. Here they say he was buried in Mecca. So which is it? Which came first? Was it Medina or Mecca? So the standard Islamic narrative keeps shifting over time by the looks of it. So interesting. So that second report from 1433. This is it in Chinese with the key bit there highlighted. Good evening, everyone. As you can probably tell from the picture, I'm going to be talking about the source of the Zamzam water. And as you probably can guess, it's not somewhere as obvious as the Zamzam, as we'll find out. So the title for our video today is Mecca's Hydrological Mystery Solved. Where does Mecca get most of its water from? There's going to be two parts. This is part one, Mecca today. Saudi Arabia's water challenge. Saudi Arabia uses more water than its natural aquifers can supply. Saudi Arabia is the largest producer of desalinated water in the world. In 2011, the volume of water supplied by the country's 27 desalination plants at 17 locations was 3.3 million cubic meters of water a day, or 1.2 billion cubic meters of water a year. Have a look at this diagram here, and you notice inside the red box there gives us figures for the population of Mecca and Medina. Mecca is the third largest city in Saudi Arabia with a population of 1.32 million, and Medina is similar size, 1.3 million. And this is going to be useful because having a similar size population, they would need a similar quantity of water each day. How does Mecca support its population with water? The largest reverse osmosis plant in 2012 was located in Yanbu on the Red Sea. It supplies the city of Medina and has a capacity of 128,000 cubic meters of water a day. It stands to reason then that Mecca also needs about 128,000 cubic meters of water a day. If the Zamzam had an endless quantity of water, how much could it provide Mecca in a day? And what I mean by this is based on the pump that brings the water up from the Zamzam. How much could it bring up from the well each day? Well, the Zamzam well pumps between 11 and 19 liters of water in a second. Let's assume it pumps out its maximum. How much could it provide a day? So as you can see there, 19 liters per second. The figure that we get is 1641.6 cubic meters per day, which is not a lot. So Mecca needs about 128,000 cubic meters of water a day, whereas the Zamzam well can provide just 1,641 cubic meters of water a day at the very most. That's about 1/100th of what Mecca needs. And again, this is just based on the assumption that the pump is working at its maximum from the Zamzam well without thinking about how much capacity there is underneath the Zamzam well in the aquifers. Okay. How many people could the Zamzam support at least temporarily? Using modern technology, the water pump from the Zamzam well can pump out enough water for a maximum of 16,400 people a day until the water runs out. Okay, this again, just to clarify, assuming there's an endless supply of water down there and you're working a pump that is on maximum output. Okay. However, the Zamzam can only get limited water locally from the few times it rains each year. So without other sources of water, the Zamzam would quickly run dry. Note here, we are just looking at how quickly water can be pumped out of its aquifer, not how much water is in that aquifer. What we do know is there wasn't enough water there even to support a tiny population in the 8th century, such that an aqueduct had to be built. And we'll come back to that in part two. Based on what we know about the aqueduct that kept the Zamzam going, how long would the water last at its maximum pumping output? Okay, what would you think? 12 hours. So if we go back to our initial figure here, where we said that, if the pump was going at full belt, that's how much it could pump out a day. Well, it would only last for 12 hours. Okay, not a lot. Um, the Ain Zubayed, which is the name of the aqueduct that used to supply the water to Mecca up to 1950, only brought between 600 to 800 cubic meters of water to Mecca a day, on which the Zamzam depended on to keep it topped up. Okay, so if we do our maths here for a moment, let's be conservative and say that on average, most of the year, we're talking about 600 cubic meters per day to Mecca. Okay, so how much would that provide? And how many people really would that support? Well, if we multiply it by 10, so we say that 10 people could live on 1 cubic meter of water a day, that would give us a maximum of 6,000 people. So 6,000 to 8,000 people could be supported um, on the water that comes to Mecca each day. And that's if everything goes well. And that's assuming that, you know, the there's no problems with the aqueduct, there's no damage to it, as we'll see later. There were numerous times in history when it was broken. But assuming that, um, okay, maximum, say 8,000, let's be generous, 8,000 people. Um, let's imagine there were, say, a couple of thousand people living in Mecca at any one time. That would mean that in terms of pilgrims, the most the town could support would be an additional 6,000 visitors to the Hajj. Okay. Um, do you see a problem there? That would mean that even for the much lower population of Muslims that were in the world at that time, Mecca was really a small affair. There weren't many people visiting it on a Hajj each year. And this is true right up to recent times, right up to 1950. It just couldn't support any more than a few thousand visitors each year. And that's shocking, maybe. But if you have seen some of the photos of Mecca from the early part of the 20th century, it kind of makes sense. You can see how backward it looked and how it was nothing like what it looks like today. Pretty much looked like a village, you know. That's why it was simply because you couldn't support a bigger population than that using that aqueduct. Okay. Now, if Mecca needs 128,000 cubic meters of water a day, it has 1.3 million inhabitants, then that means 1 cubic meter of water is needed for every 10 citizens. And this is a point that I've already said, but it's probably worth repeating. Okay, so it's a good figure to keep in mind. Cubic meter water per 10 citizens. All right. Now, so where does Mecca get all that water then from? Mecca receives its water from desalination plants in Jeddah and Shoaiba, just south of Jeddah. You may have heard that name of Jeddah before, but maybe not so much Shoaiba. It's interesting. Shoaiba is an alternative Arabic name for the Red Sea, and it refers to Jethro. So that's just south of Jeddah. That's where it gets its water. So these desalination plants provide Mecca with the water it needs on a daily basis, 128,000 cubic meters of water. And to put that into terms that we can maybe relate to. I've done the math, and it would give us a figure of 51 Olympic swim pools of water a day, or 7,100 of those tankers. So that's a lot of water a day. So you can see, in order to keep Mecca going, it needs a colossal amount of water a day, which is coming from those desalination plants in Jeddah and Shoaiba, just south of Jeddah. Okay, it doesn't come from the Zamzam, and as we'll see, that aqueduct that did great until 1950 for a tiny population, it just wasn't up to it. It couldn't. It wasn't enough to keep a much larger population going. No. So, approximately working at full capacity, the Zamzam well can pump out 1,641 cubic meters of water a day, but Mecca's population needs 128,000 cubic meters of water a day. Do you see a problem? It's just not up to it. However, by itself, the Zamzam runs dry, and its water these days comes directly from the mains via a desalination plant in Jeddah. And here's what I believe is the very plant in Jeddah. Okay, and literally people who are going to Mecca drinking water that they believe comes from the Zamzam, well, it came from the Red Sea. They took the salt out at the use of an awful lot of energy, pumped it south to Mecca and into the mains, into the aquifer under the Zamzam, presumably, if not directly, into the pipe that supposedly comes from the Zamzam. And people are going home with their bottle of Zamzam water that's really Red Sea desalinated water. So now, in part 2, we are going to look at the story of how the aqueduct was built to get water to Mecca to keep the supply of water going for the people who went on pilgrimage there. So in part 2a, we're going to look at the story of how one woman brought water to the well. Her name was Queen Zubaydah, a remarkable woman. I would say probably one of the most influential women in history. She's definitely up there, I would say, in terms of the top 20 or 30 women in history, and you'll see why in a moment. She was a very intelligent woman, and she helped save an awful lot of works of literature that could have otherwise been lost. So I think history owes her a great deal. So, who was Queen Zubaydah? She was an exceptionally intelligent woman that Islam owes the credit of its golden age to. Queen Zubaydah was born in 762 in Mosul, in present day Iraq. Her father died when she was only 1 year old, and she grew up with her grandfather, Khalifa Mansour. Zubaydah, in her youth, studied the Quran and Hadith and took special interest in religion, poetry, art, history, literature, and science. After her grandfather's death, one of her paternal uncles looked after her. As you can see, she had a very broad interest in things. She was probably a polyglot, someone who had an exceptionally great grasp of a whole range of different areas of knowledge. So, incredible person for her time. Zubaydah married the fifth Abbasid caliph, Harun al-Rashid. She lived for another 32 years after the death of her husband and died in 831 AD. Queen Zubaydah was greatly remembered for her achievements in the history of Islam and is regarded as talented, intelligent, serious, and dedicated. She invited scholars and poets to Baghdad and allocated a fund for this purpose. So essentially, she was a patron of the arts. Apart from Ain Zubaydah, which is the name of the aqueduct, Queen Zubaydah and Caliph Harun al Rashid completed a number of projects in their reign. The Queen and her husband gave much importance to the construction of Beit al Hikmah Library in Baghdad, as well as other research, educational, and translation centers. Translations of literature from Latin, Persian, Chinese, and many other languages into Arabic is considered one of her life's lasting achievements. Books and manuscripts were brought from different parts of the world to Beit al Hikmah Library. After all these centuries, this library still exists in Baghdad. Now to part 2b. To be or not to be. Where and how did Mecca get its water for pilgrims over the centuries if the Zamzam had such limited capacity? For the water supply to Mecca, Queen Zubaydah commissioned two aqueducts. One was from Wadi Hunain and the other from Wadi Numan, east of Arafat. The latter, as it was close to Arafat, is sometimes known as Ain Arafat, while it is more commonly known as Ain Zubaydah. And you can see down below the source for all of this information in this video. And it's funny too how Mecca doesn't appear on maps until the 9th century, when we consider when this construction was completed. So the construction of the aqueduct began in the 8th century and was completed in exactly 801 AD to provide a permanent water supply for the pilgrims and residents of Mecca, which means it was completed at the beginning of the 9th century. So it's interesting how it was Patricia Crona who said that Mecca only starts to appear on maps in the 9th century. Now it's starting to make sense why that would be the case. Without water, there were no people there. 791 to 801 AD, that's when it was built. It is named Ain Zubaydah, Spring of Zubaydah, after the wife of Caliph Harun al Rashid. It was Zubaydah who commissioned and paid for its construction. The project required 10 years to complete and was 38 kilometers in length from Wadi Numan to the present day Al Aziyah neighborhood of Mecca. Only estimates remain as to the cost, variously being in the region of 1.7 million dinars. At that time, 1 dinar was equal to 10 grams of gold, 24 carat. So obviously, it cost a fortune. Here is a map of the route from the Wadi Numan into the center of Mecca, uh, where the Zamzam well is found, and it's located where you see the words Al Haram there towards the left of the map. Okay. It was down to her that the waters of Wadi Numan and Wadi Hunain were brought to Mecca, Arafat, Muzdalifah, and Mina in order to provide a permanent and reliable source of potable water for both the local population and pilgrims. Didn't quite work out as permanent as it happened due to various damage to the aqueduct over the centuries, as we'll see later. After the death of Caliph Harun al Rashid, Queen Zubaydah travelled to Mecca to perform Hajj. It became apparent to her that Mecca was facing a water shortage, and when she returned to Baghdad, she called on expert architects and engineers of the time to address this problem. After surveying the area, the initial report concluded that construction of a qanat would prove quite difficult. History relates the Queen's reply as construct a qanat at any cost, even if I have to give a dinar in exchange for every single stroke of spade. And I think it's worth pointing out here at this stage This completely flies in the face of the story that the Zamzam was a place where you could get an endless supply of water. Clearly, you couldn't. They wouldn't be going to this great expense if there was all of this water available underneath the Zamzam. The engineers then conducted a more detailed survey of the same area and decided to bring water to Mecca from both Wadi Hunain and Wadi Numan. In both the wadis, the groundwater level, the water table, was higher due to more frequent rains and the subsequent runoff from the mountains. At first, water was brought from Wadi Hunain by digging wells. Huge tanks were made to store water, which was brought via the Qanat from Wadi Hunain. The remains of these tanks still exist today. In 1950, the groundwater got too low. Ain Zubaydah remained in use until 1950. The Qanat has thus stood as a testament and remarkable legacy of the Abbasid period. Modern pumping and increased consumption eventually depleted the well at the source, as the level of the groundwater fell too low to sustain the flow of water through the Qanat. Ain Zubaydah is now dry. I'm just going to show an image of what Mecca looked like around the year 1950 when that well ran dry. So you can see how primitive Mecca looked, and that was because they didn't have a great supply of water and it really limited its development. How much water could it bring to Mecca? The then engineers calculated the water ration per pilgrim that we have our first estimates about 600 to 800 cubic meters of water daily of the flow arriving in Mecca. Today, Mecca needs 128,000 cubic meters of water a day. The Abbasid Caliph Jafar ibn al Mu'tasim ordered the renovation of Ain Zubaydah after a huge portion of it was destroyed in an earthquake in 952 AD. Jafar repaired it, spending 100,000 dinars. In 1236 AD, the channel stopped working again. Emir Shuban, the Tartar ruler, ordered repairs to some of its damaged walls and revived it at a cost of 50,000 dinars. In 1328 AD, the king of Egypt, Al Nasir Muhammad bin Kalawun, looking at the channel's condition, ordered some repairs of the channel. As you can see, it needs to be repeatedly repaired over the centuries. Didn't stop there though. In 1410, Egyptian king Al Muwaid mended the channel, and that was followed by Egyptian king Al Ashraf. And then in 1510, Sultan Kanosh gave directions to renovate the Qanat, or the aqueduct, in other words. The Ottoman Caliph Sultan Suleiman sent some of his experts to Mecca to make a survey of the Qanat. The walls of the Qanat were completely destroyed by then. Major effort to repair the Ain Zubaydah system was undertaken by Sultan Suleiman I's daughter, 1522 to 1578. Further repairs were carried out in 1767, 1770. Then the Wahhabis, always a friend of progress and technology, they, and I'm being sarcastic, occupied the area in 1803 to 1818, causing major damage to these waterways. Who'd have thought? The local population had begun to suffer from water scarcity, and the Ottomans repaired them in 1880. So, due to the nice work done by the Wahhabis, essentially the Hajj was massively impinged upon for much of the 19th century because there wasn't enough water. So that's a serious own goal by the Wahhabis there. In June 1880, Ayub Sabri Pasha, an Ottoman naval officer and historian, wrote a series of 6 articles. In all of these articles, he drew his readers' attention to the history and importance of Mecca's Ain Zubaydah water system. His primary goal, however, was to publicize the recent efforts of a partnership between Hijazi notables and the Ottoman administration, known as the Ain Zubayed Commission. Founded in 1878, the Commission's goal was to raise enough funds to restore Mecca's waterworks to their former glory and save the city from the looming threat of a total collapse of its water supply. The following map from 1880 was a repair plan for Mecca's water infrastructure. It depicts the principal route of the Ain Zubayed water course en route to the Haram, smaller distribution pipelines radiating out to the city's neighborhoods, fountains with underground cisterns, large taps, ablution stations with smaller taps, wells, and basins. Here it is. It's hard to make out, but you can see the different locations of cisterns and so on in those blue rectangles around the map there. So the water came in and then it was channeled out to the different locations. I think this is where the Kaaba is, there in the center. I'm not sure where the Zamzam is in relation to there. I will probably have a look later to find out, but it's somewhere in the vicinity there. And you can tell from the contour lines where the various hills are in the area. Okay. In 1926, a flood in Wadi Numan destroyed a large portion of the Ain Zubaydah. Much of the aqueduct that remained standing began to fill with sand. For 6 days, the supply of water to Mecca was suspended. King Abdul Aziz focused on the issue and sent experts to overcome this problem. In more recent times, the Saudis overhauled the system again, hooking up Mecca's water system with water from desalination plants in Jeddah. Today, Mecca's water comes from Jeddah, so Bayad would be happy. And here are some of the sources that I've used. So, what are the implications of all of this? Well, it clearly indicates that the Zamzam well isn't all it's cracked up to be. It didn't provide enough water for the pilgrims, even in the 8th century, even in the 9th century. It didn't provide enough water for the pilgrims, and there weren't many pilgrims going to Mecca at that time. Eventually, the aqueduct that was built, the Ain Zubaydah, from just outside of Mecca, that ran dry in 1950. So eventually, the supply of water was provided by a desalination unit or plant in Jeddah, which means that really the water that pilgrims are drinking, thinking that it comes from the Zamzam well, is actually desalinated water from the Red Sea. It's it's a remarkable set of facts that should really make Muslims question what they've been told over the years. So hopefully we've cleared up some of the confusion around this issue, and thank you for watching.